Hello everyone, welcome to my objective Bloodborne weapons tier list. In this video, we will be giving my objective stance on right hand and left hand weapons in the application of PvP. I've been asked to make this video for quite a long time now, well before Elden Ring even released, but I never really got to it. Better late than never, I suppose. I don't play the game anymore, but I still have a great love for this game's PvP, and this information could prove useful to those who decide to try it out. And if there's ever a remake or a remaster, assuming that the game stays relatively the same. I initially did this tier list live on my Twitch stream with my viewers, but now I bring it to you here on YouTube. If you are interested in following me on Twitch, the link will be in the pinned comment of this video. With that out of the way, let's get to it. Starting with S tier, we have the Saw Spear. Now, you may be asking, why is the Saw Spear the best weapon in PvP? It is due to its speed, damage, and range that make it the most formidable weapon. It is a dash catching machine, has one of the best dash attacks in the game, and a powerful L1 attack. If you've spent any amount of time in PvP, it quickly becomes apparent why this weapon is number one. This weapon outclasses all weapons on efficiency. Its only real downside is that it has no hyper armor at its disposal, but that matters very little when the attacks move at such high speeds. Moving on to number 1 in A+ tier, we have the Saw Cleaver. For those unfamiliar with PvP, you may be wondering, wait a minute, how is Cleaver not S tier with Saw Spear? While it is close, there is a noticeable range difference between the two weapons. Cleaver on the proper build can get slightly higher damage than a Saw Spear, but reduced range definitely makes this weapon easier to deal with. Still an absolute monster in PvP and is no doubt the second best weapon. Next we have Whirligig. In its tricked form, this weapon is an absolute beast in PvP. I used to refer to this thing as the Saw Spear on a pole. Very high damage, great reach, and near instant hyper armor is what earns it this spot. Great at dash catching, trades, and its untricked mode is no slouch either, as it is able to use adept gems and has relatively quick speed. This weapon is a meat grinder. Dashing in next, we have the Beasthunter Saved. While tricked, this weapon excels at chase downs and closing the distance. It has great hyper armor on its untricked form that often outperforms many other weapons. And it also has superb dash catching potential. It's become my favorite menu swap weapon very quickly, and I argue it is the best menu swap weapon in the game, but that's kind of another subject. This weapon does not place higher due to its neutral game being a bit weaker than the other weapons mentioned prior, and its own momentum can sometimes lead it to getting punished or an opponent getting a free heal. However, make no mistake, this is a very formidable weapon. Now we have the Rider Plash. When used in its tricked form, the Rider Plash has the potential to be the most annoying weapon in the game. It has several notable strengths, one of which is the fact that its tricked form is actually 1 frame faster than the Saw Spear and Cleaver, giving it one of the best R1 mashes in the game. And if that wasn't enough, it has a gun attached to it, which can be used to parry or stun the opponent. This weapon does have some notable shortcomings though. One being is that, well, it's short, and the reach is limited, and it also has poor tracking. Another thing to note is that the damage numbers are lower than its other high-ranking peers. Despite its shortcomings, however, you will often see experienced PvPers immediately pull Saw or Safe on this weapon, which is a testament of how strong the Rider Plash is. Coming in at the end of A+ tier, we have the Holy Moonlight Sword, which should be a strength arc weapon, is actually a quality claymore in disguise. Its high damage, great hyper armor, and reach are what place it in this tier. In its untricked mode, this weapon is very formidable, being able to make use of adept gems and abuse hyper armor. It is a much more passive weapon compared to much of Bloodborne's arsenal. What mainly puts it at the tail end of A+ tier is that it is a slower weapon than its peers, and it can be quite predictable and parryable, which is why it is often paired with Saw Spear by some tryhards, as to get the best of both hyper armor and speed out of their respective weapons. Now we move on to A tier. In first place of A tier we have the Rakuyo. Fast, versatile, and its potential to blunder foes are what place it here. A very powerful weapon, in my eyes just barely missing A plus tier. It is primarily given this ranking due to the fact that higher ranking weapons tend to have a notable advantage over it, whether it be speed, hyper armor, or both. Make no mistake, this weapon can still perform very well against weapons above its grading here. This weapon has speed, great versatility in its moveset, and even hyper armor on certain attacks, which it can make great use against its foes. Next, we have a personal favorite of mine, the Burial Blade. Its untricked mode acting as a primitive saw, which is very fitting when you consider lore-wise that it is the first trick weapon. The first two R1s of the untricked mode have great horizontal swipes that are great for catching opponents. The second R1 is a backswing, which often catches opponents trying to back away. It also has great untricked forward, side, and backdash attacks, which give the weapon some much needed mobility. Its tricked mode has decent hyper armor, but note that versus higher tier weapons, you want to lean more into the untricked mode. Untricked Burial Blade is a very formidable weapon and can compete well with higher tier weapons, but has a notable frame disadvantage against saws and Rider Plash. You can learn more information about the Burial Blade in PvP from my guide that I'll link in the pinned comment below. Otherwise, I may talk about this topic a little too long. Now on to our next contender, Ludwigs Holy Blade. The untricked Ludwigs Holy Blade is very underrated. Fast and often difficult to parry, and good damage are partially what place it here. Very basic, but very effective in what it sets out to do. It also has a devastating true combo in its tricked mode, which can also make use of adept blunt gems. This true combo has the potential to one-shot invaders. These two factors are what have led me to class this weapon among the A tiers. Thrusting in at the end of A tier, we have the Bloodletter. While tricked, this weapon has great reach, high damage, hyper armor, and a fast dash R1 attack. It also has a powerful L2 attack, which can nearly one-shot players, though this is generally easy to avoid. With all this into consideration, it is a great weapon and fairly easy to use. However, it is much easier to avoid than the weapons listed prior, assuming that your opponent's not living in an underground bunker somewhere. We have now reached B+ tier with the Church Pick. The Church Pick claims the spot with its very high damage potential in both forms with adept gems. Very similar to Burial Blade, but has some very notable differences. Its untricked mode is very limited compared to the Burial Blade, but it has a nice thrust poke and the potential to have high damage, much as the same with the tricked form. Its tricked form, while faster and also having higher damage potential than the tricked Burial Blade, has noticeably low hyper armor, often getting outcompeted by most other weapons that also have hyper armor. Its higher damage carries it to this spot. Its hyper armor and reach also help it contend with higher tier weapons that can't utilize hyper armor. Before we start this next section, I want to clarify the first three weapon placements could easily be interchanged with one another. It really depends on the player behind them in these situations. The Stake Driver claims the spot due to its speed and high damage. I often refer to it as the mini saw spear. This weapon would be placed higher if it only had more range, as it is functionally very similar to the saws, but its limited range holds it back from reaching ever such greatness. Dashing in next, we have the Blade of Mercy. Overall, a very well-rounded weapon. The untricked mode has great dash attacks and R1 spam, and its tricked mode provides quick and powerful dash R1 attacks. It is placed where it is due to the range on many of the attacks, and its best move being the tricked dash R1 attack can potentially lose out on damage if one of the blades is off target. It is also a weapon that is more specialized to skill arc builds, though it is still very usable on pure skill. Overall, the Blade of Mercy is a well-rounded weapon, although lacking in range and damage potential at times. Next, we have the Kirkhammer. The Kirkhammer earns this spot due to the similarities it has with Ludwig's Holy Blade untricked form. However, due to having less range because of its shortened hitbox and generally lower damage, it drops this weapon down to B+ tier. Another factor being that its tricked mode is nearly useless by comparison to Ludwig's Holy Blade. Overall, its untricked mode is very solid and very underrated, having most of the same pros as the untricked Ludwig's Holy Blade, but also having some very notable cons, such as a very weak tricked form, which is outclassed by most weapons in the game. Darting in next, we have the Bowblade. The untricked Bowblade has a solid moveset, not too dissimilar from the Burial Blade, but with more vertical strikes and a better tap R2. While it gets decent damage and a decent moveset, I find that it struggles versus more higher tier weapons than its peers placed above, earning it this spot. Its trick mode has a decent range attack, however, it is very parryable and fairly avoidable. This is a very middle ground weapon in my book. The Beastcutter is another middle ground weapon. Its untricked form gets decent hyper armor, has decent speed, and gets pretty good damage with adept blunt gems. All this earn it this spot. It's a fairly simple weapon with some notable strengths, but is outperformed generally by weapons with better speed. Its tricked form, while having great range, is very easy to punish with a parry. However, it is great for dealing with multiple opponents and the occasional mix-up. Sliding in at the very end of B+ tier, we have the Cost Parasite. The tricked Parasite has quite a few notable strengths, namely its range, hyper armor, and powerful AoE attack, and decent damage. Its untricked mode also has decent hyper armor and reach. However, this weapon places on the lower end of B+ tier due to some notable weaknesses. More experienced hunters can quite easily avoid its attacks, and it gets nerfed quite hard by the Choir set's Arcane Defense. Were it not for these two major factors, it would likely place a little bit higher. Swinging in at the first place of B tier, we have the Hunter's Axe. Unfortunately, the untricked form of this weapon is absolutely pitiful, only having a decent side dash R1. This is the main reason it ranks lower than weapons such as the Burial Blade. Its tricked form is much better, however, with great sweeping R1 and L2 attacks, good hyper armor, and it can make use of blunt adept gems. While a decent two-hand weapon, it is a bit susceptible to being parried, which can be overcome by smart play, but is still a notable weakness. Next, we have the Laris Wheel. While its tricked form is quite powerful with its dash R1 attacks, and the occasional R2, it is a very predictable weapon. It is carried by the damage it can deal on its multi-hit attacks in its tricked mode, which are often easily avoided by experienced players. Still quite formidable, but this is a one-trick pony weapon. Its untricked mode is sorely lacking and is among the worst weapons to use in PvP. Insert OK boomer joke. Here's the Boomhammer. Boomhammer can get great damage, especially if utilizing adept blunt gems. However, it is carried by its damage potential and hyper armor. It has decent dash catch potential, but is outperformed by weapons that can perform similar tasks, such as Holy Moonlight Sword and the Whirligig. There's really not much to this weapon. Now, moving on to C+ tier, the Chicag. The Chicag has a near legendary status, but is it really earned? The trick Chicag boasts a powerful burst damage, but that's really it. Its moveset overall is very easy to avoid, and often can get bullied by experienced players using A+ to B+ tier weapons, let alone something like a Saw Spear or Rider Plash. However, Chicag's high damage helps keep it afloat, making it still formidable and not to be underestimated. On the weapon's own merits though, it is honestly only carried by the burst damage potential, and the sidearm often accompanying it. Its untricked form is pitiful, and arguably one of the worst weapons to use in PvP. All in all, this weapon has a decent learning curve that can make it very rewarding to use. I know some will disagree with misplacement, but in my experience, most Chicag encounters I have faced, outside of a few notably exceptional players, were generally very simple to deal with. Next, we have the Tonitrus, which in a similar twist of fate as the Chicag is carried by its high damage potential. The Tonitrus has a very simple yet quick moveset held back by its limited reach and short-lasting buff, and its very easily parried trick attack. A very simple weapon with great damage potential. Not much else to say about this one. With that, we have reached C tier. Keep in mind with these weapon entries, I don't necessarily tier any of these weapons above each other. They all kind of belong in this category for their own different reasons. Now onto the Rifle Spear. This weapon's untricked attack has great reach and decent damage potential. However, it is held back by the fact that it has very poor tracking and it could do with a little more speed. Its tricked mode having very little hyper armor, and what I can only refer to as the stunted Burial Blade moveset, is not too effective generally. Its untricked to trick attack and its tricked L2 can prove useful at times, and even grant free heals for the user at the proper distance if it stuns the opponent. The Amdon Arm is a very odd weapon. Its tricked form has great hyper armor and reach, however, its low damage holds it back greatly. If it had higher damage, it would likely have a better ranking. Its untricked form is not very reliable overall, and has nothing of note to really mention. Next, we have the Threaded Cane. Like the Amdon Arm, the lower damage is what places it in C tier. The tricked and untricked mode have a decent moveset, but the lack of damage lowers its potential as a good choice in PvP. It can be argued that this weapon really belongs in C+ tier, but I feel it is a more natural fit here. Lastly, we reach the Beast Claws. Short range and lower damage is what lands it here. While it has decent R1 mash on both tricked and untricked forms, its shortcomings cannot be overlooked, and it has earned this placement. The Ruined Claws fare even worse. With generally worse moveset and dashes, it could be argued it would dip down into D tier, but we will keep it in C for the simple fact that you have a choice in which Beast Claws you wish to use. We will now move on to the left-handed weapons portion of the tier list. Starting off with S tier, we have the Hunter's Pistol, the best parry tool in the game. Has great shot alignment, and pretty good damage on high tinge builds as well. This is a very obvious choice for anyone looking to heal parry their opponent. Next place in S tier, we have the Evelyn. Although this weapon tends to be easier to strafe heal against and can miss heal parries at point blank, it still retains an S ranking due to the fact it is still a solid parry tool, but also its high damage chip cannot be overlooked. Moving on to A tier, we have the Gatling Gun. While this weapon cannot parry, it is quite good at stunning or finishing off the remainder of your opponent's HP. I have closed out many fights with this weapon, and its utility cannot be ignored. Also ranking in A tier, we have the Blunderbus, a great utility weapon. This weapon is great for parrying spammy weapons, messing up your opponent's strafe heals, and does not miss at close range. However, it tends to be fairly poor at heal parries, and its recovery time can often get it punished if the opponent iframes the shot, or if the shot somehow whiffs. Moving on to B tier, we have the Roseris and the Flame Sprayer. Similarly to the Gatling Gun, these two can be great at closing out the fight when the opponent's HP is low. However, unlike the Gatling Gun, these two weapons do not stun the opponent and have very limited range, which is why they are placed here ultimately. Starting off C tier, we have the Repeater Pistol. While functionally it could be used the same as the Evelyn or the Hunter Pistol, the primary reason it ranks much lower is that it is a waste of bullets and has a longer recovery time. There's not much else to say about this one. Next, we have the Wooden Shield and the Lock Shield. These two rank second in C due to their niche use against certain weapons and its application on the Rider Shield build. The shield excels at blocking a surprising amount of weapons, such as the Boomhammer, Chicag, Rikuyu, Threaded Cane, and Blades of Mercy. While it is very niche in application, it is very effective in what it sets out to do. Our final slot in C tier goes to the Church Cannon. Its notable strengths is its range, splash damage, and the damage it can deal on the right build. However, due to its bullet cost, this weapon must rank lower given the amount of resources that could potentially be wasted. Starting off D tier, we have the piercing rifle, a weapon that has the drawbacks of the blunderbuss with none of the strengths. This is the primary reason it places in D tier. Although it has the unique ability to pierce through multiple opponents and even Beast Roar, this is not enough to save it from its placement. For similar reasons, the next weapon in D tier is the Ludwigs rifle. There's simply no reason to ever use this weapon over the blunderbuss. While it gets more range than the blunderbuss, its more narrow cone of fire makes it less effective in the same area that the blunderbuss excels, while also having a 9 tinge requirement, which is not a lot, but certainly not worth leveling up blood tinge just to use it. Last place in D tier, we have the cannon. Its bullet cost, lack of splash damage, and slower than molasses recovery time is what places it here. We have reached the bottom of the barrel, folks. Placing in F tier, we have the Fist of Graa. Its low damage, limited range, large stamina cost, can't parry, and that itself can be parried is why it ranks here. While it does have some true combos it can utilize with other weapons, it just isn't enough to save this. At the bottom of F tier, we have the Torch and the Hunter's Torch. It places here for all the same reasons as the Fist of Graa. And why am I even explaining this? You know why it's here. This will conclude the weapons tier list. Thank you for all your support, and to those who hung out in the Twitch stream. Take care of yourselves and stay safe. Umbasa.